So in this app, we're going to take things a step further with tables and also with nib files. We're going to consolidate a lot of things we learned in the last app, and we're going to produce something like this. Now, this is not a very neat looking final product, but it gives you an idea of what we're going to have. We're going to have a home page. We'll hit a begin button. We'll have a list of different teams. So now we're going to have a customized cell. By default, we saw in the last app that was just one generic, bland, boring line. Here we have a title, a subtitle, and a logo for each of these. And so that's why I had you guys download these images already, just to have them ready to use in our project. If I click on any one of these, like for example, I click on Leafs, it'll display the web page for the Leafs. Right? If I click on Jays, it'll click on display the Toronto Blue Jays website. Right? So that's the idea. And it looks like the Jays in Boston are playing right now. There's 2 out. Yeah, exciting. Well, anyway, coming back to that later. But you'll see here that all the different sports teams have a website that you can click on and go to. And this is the final product we're looking to build here. So what we're going to do is create a new project. It'll be a single view application. We'll call this one nib files and tables 2. Or maybe we'll call it nibs and tables 2. That's a bit long. Nibs and tables 2. So the last app was called nibs and tables 1. We'll call this one nibs and tables 2. This is part 2 or version 2. And language objective C, it's a universal app. We'll uncheck all 3 items. And then we'll hit next, give it a home, and we'll hit create. Okay, I'm going to adjust my view here. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do first is something that scares us completely, and that is to delete main.storyboard. So hit delete, move to trash. So storyboard's gone. And if we look at our project settings, let's really remove it by going to main interface, where it says main, blank that out and hit tab. So yeah, you got to hit tab to make sure that it actually really disappears. So main interface will be gone. Now let's organize our files and add the files we need to add here. So we'll right click on nibs and tables 2. We'll say new group. And we'll create one called view controllers. Create a new group. Call this one nibs, and actually mean it this time, as it'll actually be nib files that go in there. New group, special classes. And finally, new group, images. We haven't had images in a while, so now we're going to have images again for this particular app. And we can move appdelegate.h and .m over to special classes. We'll move viewcontroller.h and .m over to view controllers. Move launchscreen.storyboard over to nibs. And at this point, we have all the files that already exist in their proper place. What we want to do now is bring in the files or add files to this project or create new files for this project. So first thing we'll do is actually add a couple of view controllers. So we have viewcontroller.h and .m, that signifies our home page. But let's add 2 more. So we're going to say new file. And it'll be iOS source Cocoa Touch class. We'll hit next. It'll be a subclass of UI view controller. This will be called choose site view controller. So we're choosing the website we want to view. So that's why we're going to call it choose site view controller, subclass of UI view controller, and check off also create XIB file. All right, so that auto generates all the settings, that auto generates the nib file, just to make life easier for us. And I'm going to go with an iPhone. You're more than welcome to choose an iPad if you want to try that out. But I'll go with iPhone, and language is Objective-C. And give it a home. And you'll notice that it created choose site view controller.h, .m, and .xib. I'm going to drag the .xib file over to the nibs folder. And I'll create a new object again, so we'll say new file. iOS source Cocoa Touch class. We'll hit next. I'm going to call this one view site view controller. So this will be the page that when we click on a particular team, it'll redirect with a web view that will allow us to view the website for that team. So it's a subclass of UI view controller, and I'll check off also create a nib file for the iPhone and language Objective-C. We'll give it a home. So now we have view site view controller.h, view site view controller.m, and view site view controller.xib. All right. And now we'll add in. So we created extra nib files, but we don't have a nib file for the home page because we deleted it. It was already in the storyboard. The view we wanted was in the storyboard, main.storyboard. We deleted main.storyboard. So now we have to create a nib file to replace that home page that was auto-generated. So we'll right-click on nibs and say new file. It'll be iOS source, iOS or user interface view. So iOS user interface view. We'll hit next. And I'm just going to call this one view.xib. And create. And so what we'll do is, before we start configuring the pages, let's bring in our images. So I had you guys download that w9images.zip file which had all the images. So you should already have the logos for all the different teams we're going to work with. So we'll right-click on images and say add files to nibs and tables 2. And then go ahead and navigate to where your files are. And I'm going to do the same. And so you should have your image files here. If we have a quick peek, they're just tiny little icon files for each of the different sports teams we are going to bring into this project. Okay, so let's start by configuring the views for all of these pages. Let's start with launch screen.storyboard. I just want to have the home page display, or the launch screen to display the word loading. So let's start by configuring. So first off, we go to view controller. So again, this is a storyboard, so it's not a nib file, so there's a difference here. So we see view controller, we click on view controller, we go to attributes inspector. I'm going to stick to the iPhone 5 or the 4-inch iPhone. Orientations portrait. And I'm going to throw a label on. And I'll center it, put the word loading, and increase the font. Let's go with like 26. And maybe add some color. Let's go with orange. Right, so my launch screen will have the word loading. And so I'll save that. And now let's go to view.nib. And again, this is a nib file. So let's start by configuring it. So highlighting view, highlighting the attributes inspector, we have size. Let's make it a 4-inch to be consistent. Orientation, portrait. And of course, you're welcome to use different whatever size you want to use. So if you're using an iPhone 6 as your simulator, you want to make sure you choose the size accordingly. All right. Now, because we generated this nib file manually on its own, not part of the view controller, we have to actually associate it with viewcontroller.hnm, the object itself. So the first thing we're going to do is go to Files Owner and go to the Identity Inspector, and under Class, we're going to type in View Controller. Right? So that's going to connect the View Controller object to the View Controller's XIB file. So these two files are now linked together. Then we'll go over to the Connections Inspector, and we'll see View. We want to connect this view variable to this view over here. So we want to make that connection right there. This is already done for us in the XIB files that were generated with our objects, but it wasn't done with an XIB file that was generated manually like this. So we're connecting view to view. All right, so now we have two views connected. We have our home page configured. We can go ahead and add a label over here. And shall center it. And I'll say Nibs and tables 2. Title of the app. I'll add the same color again, orange. Increase the font. 26 again. So I have my title. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a button to go to the next page. So I'll say button. And for the text for the button, I'll leave everything else the same and just say let's begin. And that'll be it for the home page. Now let's go over to choose site view controller.xib. And let's configure this. So view, we'll set the size to an iPhone 4-inch. Orientation, portrait. And let's add a navigation bar here. So say nav bar. And let's make the tint orange again, so make it consistent. I'm going to say choose site. and then add a back button to this. So bar button item, and this will be back. And the last thing we'll add is a table view. So we'll say table, and we'll bring a table view to fill up the rest of the screen. And we won't connect the data source and delegate just yet. We'll just leave it like this. We'll connect it later because we want to make sure that we can display this page. And we're going to change up the code that we're going to use to display this page to simplify it. So we'll save this file and consider it done. And we'll polish off the final nib file, and then we'll pause it for now. So we'll go to viewSiteViewController.xib, add a navbar here. Before we do that, we should configure the size. So we're going to say size is an iPhone 4-inch, orientation portrait, and now we can add our navbar. This will be for the title of view site. And its bar tint will make it consistent orange. And we'll add our back button. So we'll say bar button item. And we'll put the word back. Now this open space down below, we want to have a web view so we can view the website of the corresponding team we're going to click on. So we want to bring in a web view. And fill up the rest of the screen. And what goes along with a web view is an activity indicator. So we want to bring an activity indicator view, put it right in the center of the web view. And we can configure the size. I'm going to go with a large white and change the tint to be orange for consistency. And I'm going to save this. And so at this point, we've configured the views that we have for our app. We've configured the project itself, brought in the files we need. We have our images that are downloaded and ready to use. So we brought them into the project as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move over to the app delegate file. And we're going to do a lot of the things that we did last time in the last app. But this time around, we're going to take a more simplistic approach to it. So last time around, what we did was we imported the header files for the different view controllers that were out there. So we're going to start by doing that here. So we're going to say import view controller .h import choose site view controller .h import view site view controller .h. So we're bringing in our three header files that we were using the last time around, but we're also going to define our constant. So last time we defined a constant to time how long the animations will take. We created a variable called animation durations. Let's just do that again now since we're at it. So we're going to say pound define animation duration. Set it to 1 second again, so 1.0. So at least we'll get that out of the way. Now what we're going to do is we're going to define our 3 view controller variables. So we'll say view controller. I'm going to call this one home VC again. Then we'll say choose site view controller. So this was the second page. And this will be choose VC. And then view site. You gotta be very careful. So view site, not view controller, but view site view controller. Call it view VC. And we'll do the property declarations for the 3. And so for now our header file is done. We're going to come back to it, but for now we'll leave it like this. So the idea here is that we've created 3 variables, home VC, choose VC, and view VC. They'll each represent each of the individual different view controllers. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come back and finish off this header file with a couple more constants that we'll talk about in a moment, and some and the prototype declarations for the different methods we're going to create to expose to the outside world. So what we're going to do now is start off by synthesizing our 3 variables inside the M file. So we'll say synthesize. So view VC, choose VC, and home VC. And we'll also synthesize window. So just to recap, window is the variable that's a interface between the physical hardware, the actual physical screen, and our app. So if we want to swap any pages in and out of the screen, we go through window. It's the middleman. So now our first goal is to go into did finish launching with options and get the home page to load. To do that, we have to do some initialization of window and instantiating the home page, and then going in and setting it up to load that home page. So we're going to start here inside did finish launching, and we're going to initialize the window object. So we're going to say self.window is equal to UI window alloc, and we'll use init with frame. And we'll talk about the CG rect object a little bit later on in the class today, but for now what we'll do is we're just going to pass in an object or a value that houses how big the screen is. So am I dealing with an iPad screen, an iPhone 6 screen, an iPhone 6 Plus screen? What screen am I dealing with? For doing that, we're going to call upon the UI screen object. It's going to look upon the main screen and return the bounds of the screen. So at this point now we've initialized the window object. And now what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate the home page. So we're going to go into self.homevc and instantiate it. So we'll say we're going to say view controller alloc init with nib name. And so again, we're going to pass in the nib file name. So in this case, it's viewcontroller.xib. Or actually, in this case, view.xib is what we're going to call it. So you have to be very careful about the spelling. So view.xib without the xib extension, of course. Bundle will be nil. We're not passing any data in. So home VC, view controller alloc, init with nib name, view, and then bundle is nil. So at this point, we've initialized the window object, we've instantiated it, and essentially initialized the home page's view controller object. Now the next part is to actually join them together and basically say, let's make the home page or home VC our home page. So we'll say self.window.root view controller is equal to self.home VC. And once all this configuration is done, we just go ahead and tell the window object to go ahead, light up, and make this happen. So now we could say self.window make key and visible. So I'm going to use an iPhone 5S and run it. So here's our home page. We have that loaded up. Let's begin doesn't work because we haven't got our event handlers up and running yet, and our page swapping methods up and running yet. But at least we should have the home page up and running. Okay, so now that we've got the home page up and running, let's focus on getting the code to swap pages. But this time we're going to take a more simplistic approach to it. So first I'll put in a #pragma. Of course you don't need this to write the code, but it's good for organizing my methods here. So #pragma mark will say app methods. And then I'll say #pragma mark, and I'll say view methods. And if we look over here to the side, we should see view methods and app methods in our listing. And so this will help us organize our code a bit better. So last time around, what we did was we created a method called, with a void return type, flip to something. So now I'm going to call this one flip to choose site. And what we'll do is we'll walk through the code. We'll write out this entire method like we did last time around. And then we'll analyze it and see how we can simplify this code. So let's start off by just defining what we need to define here. So we're going to start off by instantiating the choose site view controllers object. So we'll say self.chooseVC is equal to, and then choose site view controller alloc, then init with nib name. And so our nib file name in this case is choose site view controller.xib. So we're going to put that in. So we're going to say choose site view controller without the .xib and put nil for the bundle argument. So now we've instantiated the choose site view controller object. Our next task was to get the animation going. So we'll start off by telling the system that we want to begin an animation. So we'll say UI view begin animations nil and nil. And then we'll tell it how long the animation is supposed to be. So we'll say UI view set animation duration to animation duration, the variable we created in our header file. And then we'll say UI view, we'll tell it what kind of animation. So we'll say set animation transition. And this time we're going to use UI view animation transition. We'll just use the flip from left and flip from right. So last time around I illustrated having different kinds of animations in the same app, but it's not really a good idea. We want consistency in our app, so we should pick one. So I'm going to go with the flip methods this time around. So we'll say flip from left for view window. Caching it, yes, we'll cache it. So at this point we've got the animations all set. Now at this point what we can do is we can swap the pages. So our first step is to take the current page off the screen. And it's assumed that if we're running this method, we want to go to the choose site view controller page. That means that we're on the home page right now. So we want to say self.homevc.view remove from superview. And then we're going to add in the new page. So we'll say self.window, add subview, and we'll say self.choosevc.view. And the last step is to basically make it all happen. So we'll say UI view commit animations. And this was our method to get the home page removed from the screen and then put the choose site view controller page onto the screen, but add a little animation to it at the same time. So three things were happening here in this little method. But we noticed the last time around that when we were creating these methods, that there was a lot of repetition in these methods, a lot of repetitive code. And we could have simplified this code down last time. But it was good to practice it, really understand it, before we actually go into simplifying this code. Because there's a lot of things going on here that we need to understand. But this time around, I think we're comfortable enough where we can actually simplify this code. So let's examine what's here. Our first line of code is instantiating an object. Right? I think that's pretty exclusive to this particular method that we can leave that alone. But the next three lines are all about creating an animation, telling it how long it is, and telling it what kind it is. This code could probably be moved into its own method and called. So let's create a new method above. It'll be a void return type, and we'll call it setupAnimation. No arguments for now. And let's take this code, these three lines of code, so begin animation, set animation duration, set animation transition, move this over to setup animation. So now we've taken those three lines of code, we've moved it over to setup animation, and we'll just call setup animation where we actually remove that code. So we'll say self setup animation. But before we go further, let's look at this method. So this method is always flip from left, it's always caching. But if you recall from the last app, we were returning back from a page. So if I was to create the flip to choose site home method, we were going the other direction. So we were going to choose flip from right. And we weren't going to cache that animation. So here's the thing. We want to have a way to set up an animation for each direction. Now we could have a second method that would just illustrate that, but that's kind of redundant. So why don't we have an argument passed in that'll actually dictate am I going forward in time or backward in time. So to do that, let's go back to the header file and define a couple more constants. So we'll go to appdelegate.h. Under the pound define for animation duration, let's create a couple more. So we're going to say pound define, call this one forward, let's call it and set it to 0. And then we'll do pound define, and we'll say backwards, or backward to 1. So we have forward is 0, backward is 1. We just pass in forward and backward. So we need to pass an argument into setup animation. So let's do that. Let's pass in an NS integer. And we'll call it direction. And then we'll put an if statement for that last line. We'll say if direction equals forward, we'll do this. Else, well, I think it's pretty safe to say it's backwards if it's an else. And so let's copy this line and duplicate it, but just modify it for the backward scenario. So for the else statement, we'll change this from flip from left to flip from right. and we'll take out the cache and say no, we're not going to cache it. And so now this method is complete because now we're allocating, we're basically dictating which direction we're going. But now we have to account for it inside flip to choose site. So if we look back at flip to choose site, we say self.setupAnimation. We tell it what direction. And since we're going to a new page, we want to say forward here. So now the animation method is complete. So we basically taken a new method, told it we're going to begin an animation, set its duration. Are we going forward or backward? But we dictate the transition based on whether we're going forward or backward. And so we just call setup animation down here inside flip to choose site, and we just tell it we're going forward. But let's look at the next 2 and 3 lines of code here. So these 3 lines of code are duplicates. These get repeated over and over and over again, but we have different values. So in this case, we're saying home VC and choose VC. We might have had other view controllers that were swapping in and out of the screen. So we could still take advantage of creating a general method for this operation. So let's do that. Let's create a new method. Do it down here. Be a void return type. We'll call this swap views. And let's take those 3 lines of code and move them up here. Now, this method is kind of exclusive to this one operation because we're taking off the home page, we're putting the choose site page on, which isn't really useful for us. It's good for this one particular operation, but we have other pages we want to swap in and out of the home page again. So we want to make this exclusive to everybody. We want to open it up to everybody that can swap pages in and out. So let's look at the 2 arguments that really change here. It's self.homevc.view, that always gets removed, and choosevc always gets added in, or whatever views they are. So let's actually add in some arguments here, and let's look at the types. So we have view and view, right? These both are of type UI view. Both of these items are of type UI view. So let's pass in 2 arguments of type UI view. So we'll say UI view star, and we'll pass in, let's call this first one from, to dictate the page we're going to come from. And we'll dictate the page that we're going to with a label. Let's just say going to as our label. And it's type UI view star. And we'll put the word to. So we have a from variable and a to variable, both of type UI view. The second argument has a label called going to dictate that second argument. And so let's replace the variables that are here. So we'll say self.homevc.view, replace it with from. And then self.window add subview. For self.choosevc.view, let's replace this with to. So we have from and to. And so now that we have a generic swap views method here in place, now we can actually go in and call this method. So we have flip to choose site down here. We have instantiated the choose view controller. We have set up animation to go in a forward direction. Now let's call that swap views method. So the way we would call it is by saying self swap views. Our from was self.homevc.view. Our to is self.choosevc.view. With a semicolon at the end. And so now flip to choose site is complete. It's simplified. We could actually write out all 4 methods, or the other 3 remaining methods right now, and finish it off really quickly. Okay, so let's keep going now. So we've created flip to choose site. Let's create the remaining methods here. We'll take advantage of those. So let's do the flip to choose site again, but this time we'll create a new method, void return type. We'll say flip to view site. We're going to instantiate self.viewVC. So it's equal to view site view controller alloc init with nib name, passing in the nib file name of view site view controller. Bundle is nil. So view VC is instantiated. Now the next step is to call setup animation. So we'll say self setup animation. We're going to go forward in time. And then call swap views. So self swap views. So now the question is, what are we putting into this method? So at this point, if we're going to the view site, it means that we have clicked on a cell in the choose site page to go to the view site page and view the web page of that particular site. So what we want to do now is pass in the choose page and also pass in the view page. So we're going to start off with self.choosevc.view and then going to self.viewvc.view. And that's it. So now we've reduced it down to 3 simple lines of code. So now we have flip to choose site and flip to view site, really simplified down. But how will we do the other methods to go back in time? So for example, flip to choose site home. So let's create that one. So void return type, flip to choose site home. We don't need to instantiate anything for this method. We just want to go back in time. So let's set up our animation. So self setup animation backward. Self swap views. So now to think about where we're going here. If we're calling this method, it is assumed that we're on the choose site page and we want to go back to the home page. So we're going to pass in self.choosevc.view and self.homevc.view. But here, it's also assumed that we're done with the choose site view controller. And we know Arc would take care of it eventually, free up that memory and allocate it somewhere else. But we could also help out Arc by just setting self.choosevc to nil. Because we're done with it at that point. And let's finish off that last method, void return type. Call it flip to view site home. And again, we'll go through the same motion. So we'll do self setup animation backward, going backwards now. And let's call swap views. So self swap views. Now we got to know where we're going here. So if we're calling this method, it's assumed we're on the view site view controller page. We're hitting the back button and we're going back to the choose site view controller page, the page that has the table on it. So we want to pass in self.viewvc.view and also self.choosevc.view. And then also self And then also we want to clear up the memory that we're done with. So we're done with viewVC, so we'll say self.viewVC is equal to nil. And so now at this point, all 4 of our transition methods are done, because we simplified the code down to a couple of generic methods, and we're just calling those ourselves inside these 4 different methods. Okay, so at this point, what we're going to do now is we'll create the event handlers for these methods, but before that, we have to actually put these methods in our header file so that they're accessible by the other view controllers. So I'm just going to copy flip to view site home into the header file. And I see that I can actually paste this twice and just edit it since they're very similar names. So now flip to view site is available outside. And if I take flip to choose site home, copy that into the header file, paste it twice, and now I have all my methods available to be used outside. And so, now what we want to do is we want to be able to call these methods through event handlers. So let's start off in viewController.m and create an event handler for that Let's Begin button. So first thing we're going to do is import appdelegate.h. And then let's create an event handler here. So IB action, we'll call it Let's Begin. And we'll call our appDelegate object, so we'll say appDelegate. Call it main_delegate equals appDelegate star UI application shared application delegate. And then call main_delegate flip to, well, now I can call any one of those methods. So flip to choose site is what I want. And so now this event handler is done, because we did all the hard work behind the scenes in the appDelegate file. So now let's handle the back button. So let's go over to choose site viewController.m and let's import the appDelegate file again here. And create an event handler here as well. So IB action, call this one go home. And so call appDelegate again, main_delegate. UI application, shared application, delegate. And then call main_delegate, flip. Now which one do we want? So we're in the choose site view controller, so we want to go choose site home. And so now all of our event handlers are created for these 2 methods. So what we'll do is we'll connect these up and actually run the app. We won't deal with the view site methods just yet, because we actually have to implement the table methods, get those going, and then that way we can actually call those methods at that point. Otherwise, there's no point for now. So let's go over to our view.nib and connect up the event handler. So we'll make sure that Files Owner is highlighted and our Connections Inspector is highlighted. We'll see Let's Begin. We'll say Touch Up Inside for that one. And let's go to Choose Site View Controller. Make sure Files Owner is highlighted again. We see Go Home is here at the bottom. Connect that to our back button. And you can give this app a run now. Okay, so there's our loading page. Here's our Let's Begin button. We'll click on that. We'll end up at Choose Site. Our table is empty, which is great. Hit back, and we're back. So now we've gotten the navigation part of going from the home page to the Choose page up and running. Okay, so now that we've got the home page navigating to the Choose page, the next step now is to configure the table on the Choose page. So configure this table so that we can get the Choose page to display, and then also get some items to display in the table so that we can click on that and then get the view page, or view site page to display, so that we can get a website to display on that page. But for now, let's focus on the event handlers, the methods for the table view. So the first step we're going to do is, since we're on the Choose page, let's click on the table view itself, and notice that there's data source and delegate. And we want to connect these guys to Files Owner. Now, what's happening here is that there's, if you recall from the last app, there are special methods inside the table view that support the table view. And we can't configure a table view through Interface Builder. So we basically, when we're connecting data source and delegate, we're basically telling the Choose Site View Controller object that, hey, there's some methods inside the Choose Site View Controller object that need to be executed and implemented to be able to support the table and get the table up and running and displaying what we want to display. So now that we have data source and delegate connected to Files Owner, let's move over to Choose Site View Controller.h. Now normally, what we may do is pull, either we're going to hard code information to display in the table, or we may pull that data from the internet through a database or whatnot. We're going to take the road of just hard coding our information. Now in this app, what we want to do is we want to display 3 items on each cell. We want to have a primary label with the team name, a secondary label with the website of that team, and the image to display a logo for that particular team. So that's our goal for the cells for this table for this app. Last time around we just had one simple label for each team, and that was our little introduction, getting our feet wet into tables. This time around we want to enhance the table and make it look a bit better. So the first thing we want to do is bring in a couple of interfaces, or protocols. So we're going to implement by using the angle bracket. We'll say UI table view data source and UI table view delegate. So we want to bring those guys in. And as we learned in the last app, it's very painful to type out the support methods for the table, so it's best to actually bring in these protocols so that we can have the ability to autocomplete and make life a lot easier for ourselves. So now that we have our data source and delegate, what we want to do is define a few arrays inside this object. So our first array, NS array, is going to be called list data, like last time. It's going to have the Toronto Sports team's names inside this array. The next array, so NS array, this one will be called site data. And so now this variable, this one's going to hold the URLs for the different sports teams. And then the third array, NS array, we'll call it image data. And this one will have the file names for the different logos. And so if you recall, we downloaded different logos and we brought them into our project. So we have them right here under the images folder. We're going to provide the file names, not necessarily the files themselves, but the file names that we want to have in our cells. So it's easier to just use file names instead of just putting the files directly in. And we'll do the property declarations for all three. We'll say a property, non-atomic and strong. And so now our table, choose site view controller table header file is complete. So we can move on to the M file. Within the M file, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by initializing these arrays, and then we'll write out our support methods. So we'll go over to choose site view controller.m. Let's start by synthesizing these guys. So we'll say synthesize, list data, site data, and image data. And then we can go over to view.load and initialize these arrays. So we'll start off by saying self.listData is equal to ns_array alloc init with objects. And so if you recall, all NS arrays end with a nil object. So we're just going to write out the different teams that we're going to have inside our list here, the different Toronto sports teams. So we'll start off with Jays, Leafs, Raptors, Marleys, and FC. And we know there's a lot more Toronto sports teams. These are sufficient for this exercise. So let's try and neaten it up a bit. So that's the array with our Toronto sports teams. The next one will have the URLs. So we'll say self.siteData is equal to ns_array alloc init with objects, and we'll do http://www.bluejays.com, and then http://www.torontomapleLeafs.com, and http://www.torontoraptors.com, http://www.marleys.ca, and finally http://www.torontofc.ca. And I'll neaten that up for you. There. So now we have an array for our list of sports teams. We have an array for the list of websites related to each sports team, and note the order. We got to make sure that these arrays line up so that we can easily pull them out without having issues. The last array will be for the images. So we'll say self.imageData is equal to NSArray alloc init with objects again. And let's look at our file name. So at this point, if you haven't brought in w9images.zip from the class website, you want to do that now. Or if you want, you could always go through the internet and you could find logos on your own and Photoshop them and reduce them down to a size of 40 by 40 pixels. So really small looking logos. You can always find your own or download from the class website. So we're going to list out these file names that are listed here in the same order that we have the sports teams. So we'll start off with jays.jpg. So jays.jpg there. So we're going to start off with jays.jpg. Note the spelling. The spelling must line up. The second one is for the Leafs. So we have leafs.png. The third one's for the Raptors. So we have raptors.jpg. The next one is for the Marleys. Notice that Marleys has marleys.jpg but with an E in its file extension. So marleys.jpg with an E. And finally, Toronto FC. This one is just fc.png. And let's neaten this up. Alright. So now we have all of our arrays initialized and ready to go. Now our next step is to create the table methods that'll support our app. So let's review what the table methods are. So the first method we want to implement will be how many cells are in the table. In this case we have five teams, 5 websites, 5 images. So really we want to return 5, but it's safe to return the length of one of the arrays. So we'll return the length of the list data array. The second method we want to implement is how thick is each cell going to be. So we are going to go with an arbitrary size of 60 pixels. It seems reasonable for the phone. For the iPad you might go a bit bigger, but essentially you're working with that. So 60 pixels. Now the next step would be to tell it what is going to go inside each individual cell, right? So last time around we ended at that. We basically defined what goes inside each individual cell. This time around we're changing things up a bit. We're going to go with a custom cell. So we're going to create our own custom cell object at that point. And also we're going to implement a fourth method, an event handler, for what should happen when we click on a cell. So that's our goal for this app for today. So what we want to do now is start off by defining those table methods. So I'm going to go down here to the bottom of the page. Maybe chalk up some space at the bottom so it's easier to read. And there. So I'll even do a pound pragma here. Mark and just say table methods. And let's start by defining the first method that I mentioned. Its return type is an NS integer. Start by typing the word table and look what pops up. It makes it a lot easier for us to call up these methods. So we want number of rows in section. This method will tell us will allow us to set how many cells are going to be in the table. So NS integer return type, start typing the word table, number of rows in section. And here all we're doing is going to return self dot we'll say list data count. So the size of the array. So that's our first method. We are telling it how many cells are going in the array, or in the table. Second method is how thick is each cell going to be. Its return type is cgfloat. And we start typing table again. We have a lot of choices here, but what we want, we have to be very careful of this choice, is we want height for row at index path. There's one above it called estimated height for row at index path. We don't want that one. We want height for row at index path. So we're going to choose height for row at index path. We'll return an arbitrary number, 60. Seems like a reasonable height for our application for the phone. So we're going to return 60. Now, next step is to tell it what's going to go on in each cell. So this return type is a UI Tableview object star, so we need that. We'll type in table, and thankfully it's the only option that pops up. So we want to have cell for row at index path. And what we're going to do is today we want to go into using a custom cell. But what we're going to do is we're going to start off by writing the code for a generic cell. Basically the same code we wrote last time around in the last app. And then we're going to modify it to have a customized cell. So let's start off by writing out that generic cell code. First thing we need is a cell ID label. So we'll say NSString. Call it cell identifier. Maybe we'll call it just cell. So this is a label that's used to define which cells, what the label of the cell is. Because we could actually potentially have more than one table on the same view controller. So, and we'd only ever have just these same methods. We won't have multiple methods for this. So we want to be able to dictate which cell we're dealing with, maybe through an if statement or whatnot. But what we're going to do is we'll just have one cell identifier because we only have one table in this case. Our next step, so to recap, what happens with this method is that it's called over and over and over again. It's called over and over and over again when we're first loading the table and we are instantiating each individual cell to paste it onto the screen for the first time. And then it's also called when we swipe the table, because what happens is that when a cell leaves the screen, it actually leaves the screen, but then it gets repurposed. So what happens is that the data on that cell gets changed to be something else and then put back at the bottom of the table or back at the top of the table to make it look like, even though it makes it look like there's like 1,000 cells, but there really is only like 10, right? So there's two approaches to it. Once all the cells are instantiated to fill the screen, then more cells get called up and repurposed only when the cell is leaving the screen. So we never instantiate anything more than what can be viewed on the screen. So our first step is to check to see if this is the scenario where a cell is leaving the screen and needs to be repurposed. So we're going to say UI Tableview call it cell, is equal to Tableview DQ reusable cell with identifier and pass in cell identifier above. So right now we're just checking to see if this is the scenario where a cell is leaving the screen. We can pull it off the screen, change the data, and put it back on the screen. If we're in the scenario where that's not the case and we're still instantiating cells and we still have room on the screen to put new cells on, then this will return nil. Basically it's telling us that no, you're not done instantiating cells. So we want to check for that. We're going to say if cell equals nil, then we're going to go ahead and instantiate a new cell. So we'll just say cell is equal to UI Tableview alloc init with style. We're going to create our own init with style constructor when we go and build our own customized cell. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to just use a generic cell. So as far our first argument is UI Tableview style default. Our reuse identifier is cell identifier. So at this point, we are handling the scenario where we want a brand new cell to be instantiated. Now at this point, we've got our cell. Either way, we have a cell object that we can work with. Either we're pulling it off the screen or we're instantiating a brand new one. But either way, we have a cell object to work with. So let's go ahead and populate the cell. So to do that, we need to know the row number of the cell. So we'll say ns integer, call it row, is equal to indexPath.row. So the argument that's passed in is called indexPath. And so you'll notice a consistency within this variable indexPath, because this always tells us the row number that we're dealing with. So now we have the row number. Let's go ahead and populate it. So we'll just say cell dot text label dot text is equal to, now the generic table cell only has one label on it, and it's called text label, and it's a UI label type. So that means the text, the dot text portion of that UI label will be where we modify the information on it. Right now, let's just take the sports team. So we'll just say list data object at index row. And at this point, we could just take that and display it and run with it. But let's put an arrow up. So because now we actually want to indicate to the user that, hey, you can click on a cell and do something with it. So let's add an accessory to it. So we'll say cell.accessory type is equal to, and this is unfortunately a mouthful, but it is UI table view cell accessory. And here we can choose, I'm going to choose disclosure indicator. You could choose anything you want and experiment and see what looks great. And at this point we're done, so we'll just say return cell, because the return type was a UI table view cell object. And at this point we have enough to run the app and check to see that our table is displaying the different sports teams. So let's go ahead and do that. Snouts loading. If we hit the let's begin, so if we hit the let's begin button, we should see our different sports teams. But nothing will happen when we click on any one of them. So let's look into creating a customized cell. Okay, so now at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to create a customized cell to replace this generic table cell that we have here. All right? To do that, we have to add a new item. So we'll put it under special classes. So we'll right click on special classes and say new file. And we'll do iOS source Cocoa Touch class again. And this will be a subclass of UI Tableview and we'll have it called, we'll call it site cell. So our class will be called site cell. It's a subclass of UI Tableview. We won't check off the create xib file. We'll keep the language at Objective-C. But we're going to use this object called site cell to be our customized cell. So we'll hit next. And give it a home. And so now it auto-generated sitecell.h and .m. And what we're going to do now is we're going to start by configuring sitecell.h. Within sitecell.h, we're going to list out our individual items for that cell. So in this case, we're going to have two labels and an image view. So we'll say UI label. Notice I'm not saying Iboutlet here. I'm just saying UI label. So we're going to say UI label, call it primary label. UI label, secondary label. UI image view, call it my image view. And we'll do property declarations for the three. And that'll be it for the sitecell.h file. So again, notice I'm not putting Iboutlet here because I'm not connecting this to Interface Builder. This is all stuff that's going to be done in code. So we're going to customize the code for this. So we can move on to sitecell.m. and go ahead and synthesize these items. We'll start by synthesizing primary label, secondary label, and my image view. Now there's a couple of methods here. We're not going to use either of these. We're not going to use either of these, unfortunately. Awake from nib is a customized method for it actually executes even earlier than a view.did_load would. So it's kind of like a constructor. It takes the same approach. It's not a constructor. It's the same approach as view.did_load. It gets executed upon loading this particular cell onto the screen. But it gets executed earlier than view.did_load. So it's actually nice for configuring if you find that things just aren't loading in the right time. You could use awake from nib. And you can actually bring in awake from nib into your view controller object as well. setSelected is a method that will be executed if you click on anything. So you can maybe have your text turn pink, or maybe have your image grow a little bit, right? So you can do customization to really fine-tune the table. But for now, we're going to start off by calling up a constructor. So we're going to have an ID return type, and start by typing init, but we want to go for init with style. So if you recall, inside that method for the table view, we instantiated a cell by calling init with style. So we want to create our own init with style. And we'll go ahead and do a couple of the most common things we've been doing for our constructors. We'll start by saying self is equal to super init with, we'll do init with style, and pass in the same arguments that were passed into this one. So style was one of them, and reuse identifier was the other one. And notice I'm actually typing them out, because without typing them out, you have those placeholders, and you'll get compile errors if you don't actually physically start typing out the variable names. We'll do an if self, and we'll return self, just to make Xcode happy. Now, what we're going to here would be configuring the different items that we just defined. So we defined primary label, secondary label, and my image view. What we're going to do here is we're going to configure each of those different items.